The survival story is forever etched in the annals of history. The year is 1916, and 6 cold, starving and dehydrated men stumble ashore on South Georgia Island and hole up in an ice cave. Their seabound journey of 1,300 kilometres in the 7-metre lifeboat called the James Caird is over. Still ahead for the 2 of the 6, the prospect of a 36-hour arduous and dangerous walk to the Norwegian whaling station and safety. In the cave, the crew's go-to handyman fashions crampons out of the boat's 2-inch brass screws for that journey. It's a sunny day in Wellington's Cemetery, and one of the favourite graves is this one. It looks well maintained today, but for a long time it remained unmarked. And now it has a headstone, and in 2004 a distinctive bronze statue of a cat called Mrs Chippy. And there are even books eulogising the exploits of Mrs Chippy, which technically was a Mr Chippy. What about the person he sits contently upon? Let's take a look at his or her gravestone. The Scotsman, Harry McNish, who settled in New Zealand. He was one of those 6 souls that made it to shore on South Georgia with Shackleton and the New Zealand Frank Worsley. Nor was McNish the only adventurer off the Endurance to rest at Kaikorai. And it's not Worsley, by the way. His ashes were scattered at sea. To find out who his other teammate was who got buried there, you'll need to wait to the end. Whilst others on the ill-fated Weddell Sea expedition would be lauded for their heroism, McNish was all but forgotten. And Mrs Chippy had a small role as to why Harry McNish's part in the expedition survival story would be airbrushed out from the Endurance saga when the record was presented to the world. For the sake of brevity, I am going to skip big sections of McNish's life, mainly go forward from his time on Shackleton's Antarctica expedition. Suffice to say, McNish, often spelt McNeish, including on the crew wrist and even on his gravestone, was born in Scotland in 1874, one of 11 children. Nor was his Christian name actually Harry, it was Henry, but he preferred to be called Harry. He had 3 wives, the first 2 died, and he had 2 children to the third. His lifelong trade was a shipwright. For landlubbers, this was basically a seaboard carpenter or someone involved with the construction of wooden vessels. McNish's carpentry skills were second to none. On the Endurance, for example, he refined the crew's quarters, built kennels for the dogs, and even knocked up a chest of drawers for Shackleton. Before his skills were ultimately put to best use, making the lifeboats fit for the rigours of the southern oceans. Some of the write-ups allude to McNish being the oldest man on the Endurance at 40 years old. This can't be true for starters, as Shackleton was 6 months older. One of the jobs McNish had on the expedition was also haircuts, a job he loathed. McNish lamented what others would think if they could see all the crew with haircuts that resembled convicts. How do we know this? He kept a diary which is preserved in New Zealand and available to read online. His record is consistently referred to by researchers to corroborate the writings of others, an important insight of what life was like on the expedition for the Great Unwashed. The ship's cat, a tiger-striped tabby, took a shine to Harry and followed him around everywhere. And in case you're wondering where he, being the cat, got his name, it was after McNish. All the crew had nicknames, which was rather cool. Biologist Thomas McLeod, Stornoway, after his hometown in Scotland. The artist George Marston, Putty. And the mechanic Thomas Ord Lees, the Colonel. Ship's carpenter Chippy and his constant companion that followed him round like a wife, Mrs Chippy. Classic, I know. It's really easy to get sidetracked with this story. Speaking of which, the only known photo of Mrs Chippy, or Mr Chippy, whichever way you want to go, is this one. And by now you'll have a good idea that that's not McNish's shoulder he's resting on. It's 18-year-old Welshman Pierce Blackborough, who was a stowaway and got slipped aboard by his Canadian mate William Bakewell in Buenos Aires. When he was discovered 3 days out of port by Shackleton, he was ropeable, to say the least. He told Blackborough, "If anyone will be eaten, it will be you." I should probably also add that 11 days later into the trip from South America, Argentina, Mrs Chippy slipped off the side of the vessel, which had to do a UE, and scooped him up out of the drink in a net. It was indeed very much a British Commonwealth expedition, which could well account for the name, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. Now let's forward to October 1915, by which time the icebound Endurance had been crushed by pack ice and its crew well and truly stranded, along with the cat and, I need to now mention, the dogs. 69 in total, and Mrs Chippy would annoy the hell out of them in their cages. They all had names, often better than the anointed nicknames of the crew if you ask me. Bummer, Satan, Shakespeare, Slippery Neck, Steamer, Stumps, Swanker. That's Swanker, by the way, not Wanker. The ship's photographer, Australian Frank Hurley, took individual portraits of all the hounds. Hurley went to some extraordinary lengths to document the expedition. And that's one amazing photo. Oh yeah, I should also add Mrs Chippy was also known to assail that rigging as well. Fitting byword to a story so full of many amazing chapters. One thing Hurley wasn't good at was snapping the crew. There are more photos of some of the more popular dogs than, say, Harry McNish. Most of the men were now in a state of shock after the abandonment and destruction of their former home. Their position was tenuous at best, and moreover, they were totally alone to their fate. The atmosphere induced the best and worst in everyone. As the ordeal worsened, resentments grew in the ranks. McNish wasn't big on authority at any stage of his naval career, preferring to adhere to the philosophy that you judge a person on their actions, not their status. One day, Shackleton decided that the men come first, and in order to survive, the dogs would have to go into the stew, literally, as well as the cat. McNish was upset with the summary execution of Mrs Chippy. Far from being heartless, though, Shackleton saw how the loss affected the crew. In McNish's case, it didn't stop him digging into the pet stew, though, and describing dog meat as tasty in his diary. Still, his resentment for authority only grew as things got grimmer and grimmer. One day, McNish cracked and had a go at the captain of the now ex-ship, Worsley, arguing over the allotted duties. He got support from John Vincent, he's pictured, who had already got into hot water with Shackleton because of his bullying tactics. McNish basically told Worsley, "You were the captain of the Endurance, and since that vessel now resides on the bottom of the ocean, you have no authority here on the ice." Knowing discipline was vital for survival, that night Shackleton read the riot act to the entire crew whilst not directly mentioning either McNish or Vincent. In Shackleton's diary he mentions, "McNish is the only man I'm not dead certain of." McNish's and Vincent's piece of dissension would not go unpunished, though, as you're about to find out. Quick advert break here to promote this story I've already covered recently, which also involves both Shackleton and Worsley. That was when New Zealand were involved in the failed invasion of Russia. Yes, no bull, New Zealanders went there. Link in the description. Onwards with the story. Eventually the 28 crew made it to Elephant Island using the Endeavour's 3 lifeboats hauled across the ice. Then 6 were picked to make the journey to South Georgia, including McNish and Vincent. Vincent was perceived to be the strongest of the crew, who were now all rather depleted, as well as being the one most likely to mutiny if left behind. The job of preparing the James Caird was down to McNish. Shackleton later wrote to the effect, "We certainly owe our survival to McNish." Shackleton only provisioned the tiny craft for a month, figuring if they were any longer out at sea, they wouldn't be alive to eat the rations anyway. The rest, the end. They did make it. Help was summoned, and those on Elephant Island picked up without a single loss of life. Back in England, polar medals were allocated to all the crew for their roles in the ordeal, bar 4. Frank McNish was one of those that missed out, and so was John Vincent. Cripes, Vincent lost his upper lip in that lifeboat when it became stuck to a metal cup. Frank Worsley clearly had a large say in that denial. The role played by Shackleton over Mrs Chippy's demise has been romanticised, in my humble opinion. This was Worsley's dictate. He remembered what had happened on the ice. Even today, relatives of the McNish family would like to right this wrong. And after the expedition, what did Harry get up to? McNish was never really the same man physically after what he went through. When he emerged after his first bath at the whaling station at South Georgia, Shackleton was shocked at his overall condition and believed, given his woeful state, rescue had come just in time. Returning to the UK, he got a job at sea with the New Zealand Shipping Company, meaning New Zealand, or NZ, was regularly on his itinerary. On one trip down under, he decided to leave his wife and life in Scotland behind and settle in Wellington. It was here he decided also to have a career change and got a job on the wharves as a dock worker. And then things turned dark. Already old before his time, he got injured. Unable to work, he relied on the benevolence of his old workmates and even slept rough in a port warehouse. Now sick and unable to care for himself, he ended up here, a benevolent home. Harry McNish died in Wellington Hospital in September 1930. His old workmates, as well as New Zealand Navy members he interacted with, knew exactly what McNish had got up to and done at the pole. They made sure he was buried with full naval honours. These are photos from his funeral cortege. It was a massive and fitting send-off. I mentioned that, interestingly, McNish isn't the only member of the expedition buried in the Wellington Cemetery. You may remember the Colonel, Thomas O'Lees, the mechanic. Yep, him. There's no way I can't briefly tell you about his life either, because it's fascinating. Despite being one of the more unpopular members of the crew, technically a German, having been born there, and Shackleton describing him in his diary as an old lady, O'Lees won a polar medal. After the ice, he became an advocate for the then experimental concept called a parachute. To prove parachutes were effective in saving lives for crews abandoning stricken balloons and planes, he even jumped off Tower Bridge in London into the Thames in front of a crowd and Air Force brass. After the war, he went on exhibition tours, jumping out of planes at ridiculously low altitudes. This is him in the drink in New York Harbour in 1919, after dropping out of a seaplane at just 250 feet. I'm not lambasting the bloke, by the way. Anyone on that expedition is a gutsy bastard as far as I'm concerned, but his contribution with Shackleton pales compared to McNish's. O'Lees did see action, after all, not only in World War I, but in the Chinese Boxer Rebellion in the early 1900s. Then settled in Japan, taught English and married a local. Some of the other people he taught about jumping from low altitude happened to be the Japanese Air Force. He also became one of the first foreigners to climb Mount Fuji, the first to do so in winter. As war loomed, the Japanese considered him an alien, and he was told to take the first boat out of there with his second missus, the first one having died. And that vessel happened to be going to New Zealand, where he saw out his days working in the educational sector. He died in 1958 at the age of 81. But let's close this off with the main theme, Harry McNish, to further connect him eternally with his adopted home. One of the relics from Shackleton's expedition now resides here in Christchurch in the Canterbury Museum. McNish's Primus. This was on the James Caird. There were two actually, one got jettisoned, but McNish's just happened to have the most fuel and it survived. And what did Shackleton say about this piece of equipment? A great note to finish this one on, I think. And thanks for your time today. You haven't misspent it. You have made a good investment. This is an amazing story on so many fronts. And a big g'day to all the overseas subscribers and viewers. Your support for growing this Labour of Love channel is noted and appreciated. I'll spot you next time for more interesting things from New Zealand.